should we give it a few minutes for you tell us when to start?
First two, so first six. So.
Okay, shall we start? Okay. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon for all of you joining us from far and wide. A very, very warm welcome to our second discussion on the recently completed elections on behalf of CPR and TCPD. It's a privilege for me to welcome all of you and to start today's proceedings. But before that, a very special thank you to the CPR TCPD politics team that have been on their feet ever since the exit polls on Monday. It's been a very, very long week for all of them, but they still remain as energetic and enthused as ever to discuss the big election of Uttar Pradesh. We made, given that there were 5 elections, 5 states going to elections, and the results of each of these have a very long-term impact on the nature and shape of our politics. We wanted to ensure that the discussion on the elections didn't get dwarfed by UP, which is why we decided to break this discussion into 2. So on Friday evening, we had a long discussion on Punjab, on Uttarakhand, on Goa, on Manipur, a little bit on UP. And today we focus exclusively on UP. So we'll follow, for those of you who were here on Friday, we'll follow the same format. For those of you who are new, bear with me for one moment. We will run through 3 presentations that we hope to do within the first 25 to 30 minutes of the hour, followed by a sort of a discussion amongst ourselves. And then we'll open it up for questions. Since this is a hybrid discussion, we have many colleagues in the seminar room at CPR. A very warm welcome to all of you. It's really nice to feel like finally the worst of the pandemic, fingers crossed. Perhaps I shouldn't be saying it, so I won't. But it's lovely to see you here in person and to welcome you. And thanks all of you who've joined us online. So please do put your questions on the Q&A box, and we'll try and integrate them both in our discussion amongst ourselves as well as in the Q&A that we'll do from about 7 to half 7. And to all of you who are here, just feel free to raise your hand so that we can try and catch both. But I would request you to be disciplined about raising your hand and not interjecting. Otherwise, it's hard to manage the online and the offline questions. So with that, we'll start with Gilles, then we'll go to Neelan, and then Rahul, in that order for presentations. Over to you, Gilles.
Thank you. All right, so what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is to go through some aspect of this election that can give us a clue about what happened. But as a precautionary measure, I have to say that when you have such decisive outcomes, our job in a way is made both simpler and more difficult because there are not that many variations that you can really look at. I mean, in other words, you can look at the data from all sorts of different angles. It will usually point towards the same kind of story, which is that the BJP did succeed in consolidating its performance of previous election. This is now the 4th election in a row that they win decisively in UP. And they've added this time the particularity that this is the first time that a chief minister is elected to a consecutive term after having served a full term in office. Before Yogi Adityanath and before 2022 election, the average duration of chief minister's terms in UP has been 2 years and 19 days, which gives you an idea of the kind of instability that used to afflict the state of Uttar Pradesh. As we know, since 2007, UP has produced single majorities And up to this year, these single majorities had been won every time by a different party, BSP, SPD, and BJP. Now the fact that the BJP has been able to win a consecutive election, of course, is hugely significant. And if you add to that the adversarial context, a more bipolar election, but also the economic context, the state of UP has been, like many other states in India, terribly affected by 3 consecutive shocks: demonetization, the overall decline of the economy in 2017-2018, and of course the economic impact of COVID, which we don't measure really well, but we know has been extremely severe in a state that still is at the bottom of most rankings in socioeconomic development. And so one of the questions that we can discuss today is, why is it that we did not see the kind of cumulative discontent about the state of the economy and unemployment, all visible and real sign of real discontent? How did it not translate into a different outcome? There are many aspects to that question. Let me start by going through some of the data, and then as Rahul and Neelanjan also go into their presentation, some of these aspects will be sort of put together. And yeah. So I think it's useful to start with the geography of the results. And first, I draw your attention on the chart on the right, which basically tells you that the mechanics of elections in India and in UP, in UP, means that you can manage to lose votes. You can manage to use seats even though your vote share increases. In 2017, the BJP wins 312 seats with almost 40% of vote share. In 2019, it increases its vote share by 10%, but it actually leads in a smaller number of assembly segments. And in 2022, it consolidates its vote share compared to 2017, but loses actually a number of seats down to 255. And that, of course, is the product of the bipolarization of the election, the fact that this was essentially a contest between BJP and SP, but it goes to show that you can still, the relationship between votes and seats is always tricky. You can lose seats even when you gain votes. The fact that the BJP gained votes despite all the challenges and all the difficulties it faced in UP, and the difficulties people of UP first and foremost faced, is a more important information than the tally of seats at the end. Then, if we look at the geography of these, the geography of these results, it throws a number of interesting. We can make a number of interesting observations. So I'll start westward and go eastwards, which was also the phasing of the election. So if you go on the northwest corner, you see a small patch of green, which are basically the RLD seats. This is a cluster of constituencies which we are all very familiar with. They've been covered in the media quite a lot, and for a number of reasons. Shamli, Budhana, Kairana, Muzaffarnagar. These are, of course, the areas most concerned by the farmers' movement in the year that preceded the election. It's also the pocket, if you will, of Uttar Pradesh most concerned by communal politics and communal violence ever since the Muzaffarnagar riot. It has a significant Jat population, of course, which was mobilized through the movement. It's been a site of experiment of Hindutva politics as well for the BJP for a long time. And in that particular area, the RLD-SP or the SP-RLD alliance clearly worked, right? They win this cluster of seats that used to be swept by BJP before. But as many of us have been saying in the past, the farmers' movement had a real impact, but remain, very localized. Because if you look at the rest of Western UP alone, the BJP actually makes its best score, both in terms of strike rate, but also it wins actually 80% of the seats in that first phase. and but also in vote share, which goes to show how polarized that election was. To go into a little bit more detail, if you look at victory margin in phase one, you see that they are particularly high both for SPRLD candidate and for BJP candidate. Whoever won in that area won big, which again is testimony of the polarized the polarization that produced that outcome. Then if you move a little bit eastward, you go to Rohilkhand, which, as most people would know, is an area, the Rampur area, which has the largest concentration of Muslim population. Muslims in Rohilkhand make up for 31% of the population. And there's a simple story of Muslim voters consolidation behind SP candidates, which brought a higher yield of quote unquote Muslim seats. I don't like to call them Muslim seats because these seats also have many other voters and a quick claim on these constituencies, but these seats, which very often split between Muslim candidates and give a pathway to the BJP. I mean, we didn't see that happening this time, and the SP had a much better yield of seats in that area, thanks to Muslim voters consolidation. And if you go towards the south, you have the Jaswantnagar, Karal, Mainpuri, Etawah area, which is the traditional Yadav stronghold. This is where the Yadav family member contest, and you can actually see that cluster there. And then you move eastward, and you have a very different configuration, where you see that the more the election moves towards the east, the more competitive the Samajwadi Party became. And it's mostly the Samajwadi Party at this point, because the RLD stops playing a role once you go east of Muzaffarnagar, basically. In the last phase, for instance, BJP and SP are really neck to neck in terms of performance. And if you want to understand, or where does that come from, if I could have 2 slides. Next one. Yes, it's interesting to put side by side the 2019 results disaggregated at the assembly level and the 2022 results. And you see that the SP has made most of its gains in areas that were previously held by the VSP. So we don't have solid data on how much vote transferred from BSP to BJP and SP respectively, but we can make the hypothesis here that a significant number of those votes went to the SP in those areas. These are areas that actually have a significant Muslim population. These are areas that have a large Dalit population as well. This is an area also where demonstrations around matters of unemployment have been more visible. And so the geography is actually quite telling. You may wonder why you have that pink tip in 2019 and how it disappears in 2022. This is the Apnadal. And the Apnadal actually, from election to election, keep contesting very different seats. And this year, probably because most of the Apnadal candidates were really BJP candidates contesting against under an Apnadal tickets. But that's more for the anecdote. Can we go back on the previous slide, please? Thank you. So this is a map of seat retention, which tells you that most seats did not change hand, which is actually a rare occurrence in UP politics. Typically, even if a party sort of hasn't managed to stabilize their vote share, they would still lose a lot of seats and they would win, lose some and win some, right? And it would balances out in the outcome. But in the case of UP this year, we see that the BJP managed to retain 232 seats, which means that it won only 23 new seats, right? So an extraordinary stability in the performance of the BJP. So the next 2 slides, please. Okay, I'll go very quickly on this. This is just more for the anecdote because there's been so much ink spilled about defectors and the role of defectors and turncoats and and the fact that the BJP made a mistake by giving tickets to so many incumbents. First of all, they didn't give that many tickets to incumbents. This year had the lowest number of re-running incumbents since 1985. But what happened is that their strike rate for the BJP is enormous, right? And so so we can't really say whether discarding or keeping their sitting MLAs mattered or not, but those who got to rerun got massively re-elected. But I think, and that as you know, the way politics getting transformed, those candidate effects seem to be sort of diminishing over time. We've spent way too much time on Mr. Moria, who by the way lost his election. Next slide. This is an important story in this election. It's the decline and the decimation really of the Bahujan Samaj Party. And you can see how its vote share in dark blue, diminishes over time. It's been steadily decreasing over time, but it really collapsed down to its 1993 level in this election, and what it means in terms of seat share, from 52%, with 30% of the votes, to only one last residual seat. A long story short is that the Bahujan Samaj Party, by and large, retains its core support base among Jata Dalit, but has lost the ability of aggregating other voters, other votes around its core electoral base. The BSP model, which became the SP model, which became the BJP model in 2017, to make a combination of core voter added to the support mobilized by their candidate on caste basis, has simply stopped, to work. The BSP and then the SP rose in UP when you could win a single majority with 30% of the votes. The way you would get 30% of the vote is by building these minimal winning social coalitions that enabled you to combine your core support base with whatever votes your candidates drawn from other groups could mobilize, and hoping that the addition of the two would be sufficient to win a seat. It's utterly insufficient when the winning threshold is above 40%, as the BJP has placed. You need more than these you need those local caste combination, and the BJP does it of course, but you need much more than that, of which the BJP did offer in this election. Next slide. And the next slide is, actually, there's no next slide.
Over to you, Neelan.
I can speak of Muslims representation in the Q&A. Thank you.
It's not working?
No, it's not working, no.
Oh,
okay.
So you'll have to move it from your end.
Sorry, move next slide.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not going to offer answers here as such, but I want to sort of think about a core framing that has since come to the fore after the election, and what disaggregating the data by phase of the UP election can tell us to make some inferences. So one question that has been on everyone's mind is that, given what Yogi Adityanath represents, right, and outward calls to Hindu-Muslim polarization in many speeches, in policy action, did it yield greater Hindu consolidation of the vote? Right? A sort of more abstract question is, when we're in a context where there is socially observably greater Hindu-Muslim polarization, how does that affect voter choices? Right? Second question is about welfareism. It's something that I think each of us actually wrote about in the aftermath of the elections, and the role that Prime Minister Modi and a pitch on direct benefit transfers, ration schemes to female voters and to male voters, right, to poor voters, had on preferences. Now, there's a data point that many of you would have seen. Every pollster, I think, actually gave this data point, where they asked a voter, did welfare benefits matter for your vote choice? And if they were more likely to say yes, then they were more likely to vote for BJP. Now, as a political scientist, I'm very bothered by that association, because if you spend any time in the field, if somebody you already know is going to vote for BJP or Modi, they are more likely to say the welfare benefit matters more for me, right? So what is the point here is that simply putting that question or that association doesn't actually give you a mechanism at all. Either welfarism is affirmative to your vote, meaning that I would not have voted for the BJP unless I got the welfare benefit, or, and there's a lot of literature on this, and some of us have contributed to it as well, which is that I may already be devoted to the BJP, I might be already supportive broadly of Prime Minister Modi. Welfare benefits become the issue that I use to justify a choice that I already was going to make, right? That cannot be disentangled from survey data, right? That is something that we need to sort of think through a bit more about what kind of impact welfarism might have had on the ground. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to try to show you some surprising data about how votes have shifted in UP. Okay, next slide. So this is just looking at 2017 data. I'm sorry, I just wrote phase-wise demographics. This is phase-wise demographics, and the strike rates are for 2017, not for the current. You'll see, I will give you current strike rates soon. So what I have done here is simply using Census 2011 data. I have aggregated at the phase level the percentage of the population that is classified as Muslim and the percentage of the population that is classified as scheduled caste. And the reason why I've done it from the census and I've done it in this manner is that we have all kinds of estimates we get from political parties, is that those are not formal estimates, so I'm not going to put them in any kind of public setting. But there's a story that is very clear here, right? Which is that the largest Muslim populations are in the western part of the state, which went to the polls in the first two phases. The second phase in particular, more than a third of the population is classified as Muslim. And what many people don't realize, we associate the BSP and Mayawati and her stronghold as being Western UP, but actually the larger scheduled caste populations start from the middle of the state and go eastward, right? And while the middle of the state, Mayawati's own community, the Jatav community, is neck and neck with the Pasi community, the Rahul community, other scheduled caste communities. Again, in phase 6 and 7, the Jatav community becomes dominant in terms of numbers, right? So this is sort of what the demographic sense of over the phases are. Now, why do I bring this up? If it is indeed the case that greater Hindu-Muslim polarization led to greater Hindu consolidation of the vote, we should see evidence of it as you go east, as the Muslim populations go down. In other words, it should be that the Hindu vote, just a sheer percentage of Hindus, means a higher vote share for the BJP. There is a state recently where we've seen exactly this phenomenon. I did not coin the term, something we call a census election, term that is borrowed from the study of South Africa, where Black constituencies, Black parties get higher votes, white constituencies, white parties get higher votes. You see exactly the same phenomenon in Assam. Everybody will tell you this is a Hindu constituency, this is a Muslim constituency, and you can guess which party is going to win. So question is, are we seeing that kind of consolidation? Next. Okay. So here's tallying the strike rates for the BJP alliance. I've written BJP plus NDA, so it also has Apna Dal, it also has the Nishad party, right? The red bars are for the 2017 strike rates, and the blue bars are the 2022 strike rates. A quick reminder, a strike rate is defined as the percentage of seats you win among those that you contest. So what this says is that in phase 1, the area around Muzaffarnagar in 2017, the NDA, the BJP's alliance, won 91% of the seats it contested. In 2022, it won 79% of the seats it contested. Yeah. Now, what I want to draw your attention to is that, first of all, there are overall decreases in every phase. Those decreases are smaller in phase 3 and 4, as Gilles showed you right in the middle of the state. And you can see how much those strike rates diminish phase 5 onward, precisely where you have larger scheduled caste populations and smaller Muslim populations. So at least at the aggregate level of strike rates, there seems to have been not so much Hindu consolidation, especially in areas where there were large numbers of scheduled castes. Many people don't realize, because we think of Mayavati and BSP as having a stronghold in the West, that actually 16 of the 19 seats in 2017, the BSP won, were from phase 4 onward. They were actually eastward, not westward. So I don't, I did the calculations. It's too complicated for here, but you can do some regression-wise analysis to see if exogenous bumps in BSP vote share are shifting towards the BJP or Samajwadi Party. It's actually quite mixed until the later phases where the vote looks like it shifted towards the Samajwadi Party, not the BJP. Next slide. Here you can see that it's basically the flip of what we just saw. The Samajwadi Party across the board is doing better. In those middle phases, it's having a harder time. But precisely in those areas where the BSP had done better, where you have larger scheduled caste populations at the phase level, not talking about at the polling booth level, you are seeing larger increases in the strike rate for the Samajwadi Party. So much so that in phase 5, it's an even split between the Samajwadi Party alliance and the BJP alliance. It's a 50-50 split, right? But you can see that other than where there's a large Muslim population, 44% in phase 2, phase 5 onward, the Samajwadi Party strike rate is 28% or above, right? It's doing quite well, right? Or doing relatively well compared to the past. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is the thing that I wanted to get to sort of think through a little bit about this question on welfarism and Hindutva, as I've sort of argued that at a minimum, the question of Hindu-Muslim polarization is vexed because precisely where the largest Hindu populations are, that's exactly where the Samajwadi Party is gaining, and probably with BSP vote share transferring towards them. We can classify using satellite data. I won't go over the mechanics of how we did so. We can classify areas that are rural or urban. This is something that I've seen Ashish, who was with us in the field, also talking about. So this is a nod to Ashish Ranjan, who has been working with us and had figured this out as well. That when we look at urban areas, and this is vote share, we see that from 2017 to 2022, the Samajwadi Party alliance gained 5 percentage points and the BJP gained 4 percentage points. So almost no change in the vote share gap in urban areas, despite the fact that we were thinking about economic anxieties, jobs, things that we associate with urban areas as being largely determinative of what might be Samajwadi Party's vote share. Now let's look at rural areas. The Samajwadi Party is gaining 10 percentage points from 27% of the vote share to 37% of the vote share, and the BJP is only gaining 2. So actually the Samajwadi Party has closed the gap quite a bit. Now, if the story was that it was welfare that won it for the BJP, that was the affirmative reason to vote for the BJP, then you should have seen greater dips in urban areas and stronger shifts in rural areas. In fact, we're seeing the opposite, right? Which suggests that there was a core set of voters who were voting for the BJP. They were telling people that this welfare matters to me. And I think we can both sort of, I was in the field with Yamini. We can talk about this in the field. If you went to a BJP supporter, they'd say, I've gotten everything. The ration was perfect, super high quality. You go to a bunch of Samajwadi voters, they would say, well, the ration hasn't been quite so perfect. It doesn't matter so much, right? This is sort of the phenomenon that you would get, right? And that seems to be borne out in the data. In my mind, what this basically tells us is that where the welfare benefits are helpful for the BJP is that it has helped the BJP hold the line. Remember that coming into 2022 election, the BJP doesn't need to win any new voters. It just needs to stem the tide, it needs to prevent others from switching the other way, right? Okay, final slide. I always give one complicated slide just to show that the way I've broken up the data is not actually what's driving this. In fact, as you're getting to more rural areas, What this is, the blue line is the vote share gap between the BJP and the Samajwadi Party in 2022. The red curve is the vote share gap in 2017. And you can actually see the gap, the difference in the differences is widening as you get to more rural areas. So one of the questions that has not been in the popular narrative is what exactly happened in rural areas. The BJP has held on to a lot of its vote share, but it seems like those are the areas where Samajwadi Party has disproportionately consolidated the opposition vote, particularly from the BSP. I'll leave it right there.
Rahul?
Okay, so after Gilles and Neelan, I don't have lots of new things to say. And so what I'm going to basically do is present certain slides just to add to what these two have been arguing. One, I think this was a mistake we were making going into the election, that we were looking at the BJP's vote share at 2017. So everyone thought BJP maxed out in 2017 and their vote share is just 37%. And because BJP, that was a black swan event, this time BJP is going to come down and elections will be much tighter. Actually, BJP had created a much bigger base in 2019. They had touched 50 and crossed 50. So if you look at this first graph, which is phase-wise, there are three points for each phase. The first point in red is 2017. 2022 is yellow, and then maroon or dark red in 2019. In each of these phases, basically, the bottom line is 2017. BJP in 2019 in the phase one had 55%, in phase two had 47, 48%, in phase three, somewhere around 50%. And the yellow portion, which BJP got in 2022, is basically between 2017 and 2019. So what BJP is losing from the 2019 base, which is 50%, and not from 2017 base, which was 37, 38%. So the social coalition or the high base which BJP managed to create in 2019 is basically the biggest challenge for any party in UP, period. What bipolarity of a system is going to do, and this is like the only law political science knows, is Duverger's law, right? That's the only law in political science. But bipolarity in any system is going to produce, and this is the challenge for Mandal parties like RJD and SP, that it will increase your vote share. Because when bipolarity will happen, you will be able to pool in votes from other opposition parties, but it will also create a glass ceiling. So this happened with RJD in Bihar. This is happening with SP in UP. This happened with SP plus BSP in 2019 in UP. That unless you have a big meta narrative that binds all small micro narratives, you will be able to improve your performance from the past, but you will never be able to cross the threshold to basically dislodge the BJP. So the only place where the 2022 vote share is closer to the 2017 vote share is phase 7, where there is still some amount of multipolarity that even the BSP was present. Otherwise, the kind of base that BJP managed to create in 2019 was really, really high. Verma, next slide. Okay, and so, and the same thing is basically playing out in terms of seats. So BJP, despite losing votes and SP gaining votes, and this is a feature of FPTP's system, and that's why I was talking to Manish also, you can never predict seats. During elections, unless you have a very, very large data, you can never predict seats. And so all this talk which happens on Twitter, on TV, even politicians don't know whether they are winning or not. Politicians are like brokers, not brokers in the political science term, but brokers of markets, right? No one knows where the market is going to stop when it's the bull run, or when how it will crash. So the conversation that, oh, these politicians are leaving BJP and joining SP, seems the wave is in favor of SP. Even seasoned politicians are hedging their bets. right? They are as informed and perhaps a little more informed than us. They even don't know that when thousands of people are voting, how can you basically know which way it will actually land up unless you had a large amount of data? And our data, before big exit polls come out, is basically hearsay conversation, which Phil wrote brilliantly about 1984 elections. It's basically, we keep talking among ourselves, and that's why a number will circulate. The number was that BJP is going to come down and will come down at 220. That's the same number you will hear from everyone because everyone was talking to everyone. Next slide, Verma. Okay, so we've been talking about this, which is, of course, what happened in 2022 because BJP in 2017 won big, and even in 2019 it's won big. The second and third parties, there were lots of votes that were getting at that level. So the margin of victory for 2017 and 2019 was really, really high. It was very high, especially in 2019. Elections in 2022 became closer, but again, it's a matter of analysts like us to see how close the election was. At the end of the day, even when you lose by just one vote, you lose the seat, right? So votes are less important in our FPTP system than winning seats. So elections became close, but that's the glass ceiling. SP can at best make elections close, cannot flip basically seats where they were trailing by a large points. Webhook, next slide, if there is anything. Okay, what we basically did here is took some ideas that Gilles and Neelanjan presented. We converted assembly constituencies into three categories. Assembly constituencies that had less than 15% Muslim population, between 15 and 30, and more than 30. And on the saffron, you have BJP, and the green is basically SP vote share. So just basically look at the dark black line in both cases. SP's vote share basically increases as the Muslim population in an assembly constituency goes up. But BJP's vote share for the first two part almost remains same. It's only in the third part where Muslims they can pivot the seat and on their own, that BJP's vote share actually comes down by a little bit. Final slide. Okay. And the same thing what we have done is for scheduled caste population. So BJP has a slightly higher vote share in constituencies that have less than average scheduled caste population comparison to constituencies that have higher than average. And in the last graph, you will basically see that BSP still seems to be holding on to what Gilles presented, a section of Dalit vote, and largely, I think, the data of Dalit vote. So I'll basically end here. And one final point, which is at least in FPTP system, we should always remember the structure of political competition, because that forces what political parties can and cannot do. That also forces what voters can choose to do. It basically creates a system of incentives and disincentives. And so now, basically, we might see this as an emerging pattern. We saw this in Assam, Bengal, Bihar, and UP. Wherever you have significant Muslim population and a BJP as a formidable player present, you are going to see a bipolarity developing. BJP will face difficulties, as Neelanjan pointed out, where census elections will take place, and especially when Muslim population is very high, like in Bengal, it's in more than 1/3. And so BJP will face the same kind of difficulty in West Bengal as SP or RJD will face in Bihar and UP.
Because these are bipolar elections.
Yes.
If you have a third party, then you have vote cutting.
Well, thank you. Thanks all three of you. I think this has been an extremely fascinating, detailed, deep dive into UP. I think before we open up to audience questions, I wanted to probe two issues. I think we across all three presentations, I think two very important, or maybe three important and connected issues are coming up. First and foremost, bipolarity. I think we ended exactly where we need to dive a little deeper. And I'm curious to hear what you have to say on two issues. So one, Rahul, as you rightly point out, that one of the challenges, so with bipolarity, the BJP has managed to expand its vote share a wee bit relative to 2017, and the SP has in some senses reached a glass ceiling. What we spoke about the difficulties of the BJP in Muslim dominated areas in a bipolar contestation. What are the possibilities for SP plus plus kind of combination, which has reached the glass ceiling of its social coalition, to expand more in the context of bipolarity?
Okay. Should I charge money from SP for this, like giving them suggestions?
Yes, indeed. And if you fail, then they'll take the money back.
Okay. So I think it's a really, really hard question. And the reason why it's hard, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but party systems constrain what other parties can do. So if you think about the Congress dominant system of 1950s and 60s, it's not that other parties were not trying or not trying hard, but they were not able to break that glass ceiling. So when you have a dominant party system, and it does not, dominant party system does not mean you have to always win election. It's just basically a combination of things, right? When you have such kind of electoral dominant party system, it's very, very hard for other political parties to basically coalesce around. So coalition formation is low for political part in the political arena as well as in the social arena. I'm not saying that cannot happen, but it's difficult. Second point is, and we were having this discussion in the previous session, and Gilles also pointed out, and I shouldn't be saying this because it's getting recorded, but you cannot win an election by basically waking up at the last minute, right? So you cannot, and especially against a formidable machine like BJP. So SP, if you think about it, was not present, in a way, was not mobilizing people as it was in September, October, as it was doing in January, right? So you have to start early. But when you start late, all you try to basically do what we do during exams, basically, rather than reading the book, we try to take the key or punji and try to basically come up with the answer. So the easiest answer they came up with was, okay, let's get all these small caste parties and we will have a very formidable alliance and we can beat them. That's basically, you are preparing for a very different kind of exam. You are preparing a different syllabus and the exam is very, very different. You can only cobble, like, so you have to form a master narrative why you are getting these parties. And two, we also need to know what the strength of these small caste parties are. On their own, they have not been able to mobilize these groups in a big way. So I'm not saying these parties are not important, but when you get them at the last minute, it creates the impression that everyone is just coming together to grab power. You have to build a narrative that there is some larger purpose for why these groups are coming, right? The way BJP creates those larger purposes. We may agree or disagree with the purpose that any party pushes, but unless there is a purpose, even the foot soldiers on the ground are not convinced why they are doing what they are doing.
So to that extent, two sort of different, but I think somewhat related questions. At one level, a lot of opposition political parties are trying to create a larger purpose around this so-called narrative of governance, right? So even the UP story, welfareism of a certain kind dominated for UP, and then in Punjab, a different kind of welfareism or governance, whatever word you want to use. I think these words are used very loosely, dominated. Is this alternative meta-narrative a narrative around my governance versus yours? Or is there a need to think harder about an ideological narrative that actually builds on in some ways what SP has done with the M+Y, but there are lots of people on the margins of the core Hindutva base, as we have seen in Neelan's slides as well, that may well move over if you're able to create an alternative ideological narrative. So all of this together to ask, one, are we seeing in this bipolarity really a competition over my governance versus your governance? Is that a fair interpretation? And is there space for pushing deeper on the ideological narrative too? Gilles?
Well, I think we need to be wary about, this sort of, headline grabbing approach, to explaining electoral outcome. Because of course we can spend a lot of time trying to assess in what ways, welfareism, welfare was important, and we can all agree that it was important, but there's not a single electoral factor that worked in isolation from others. And so did welfareism, the discourse on welfareism help the BJP? Well, yes, clearly. To what extent is something that we can discuss.
Yeah.
But what seems obvious to me is that it works in addition to the many other ways a party like the BJP mobilizes voter. And what strikes me with the BJP messaging is not only how they produce different narratives, but how they succeed in tying them together around, a personality-driven campaigning, around an overarching ideological mold, which has become almost synonymous with what the state can do for you, even though it still produces, major exclusions. And so if you look at parties that have succeeded in defeating the BJP, all of them may have had, arguments and a record to show on how they have governed their states. And these were incumbents who got re-elected in Bengal, in Tamil Nadu. But they also had a larger narrative which helped them to create broad appeal across castes, across communities, based on culture, based on language, based on regional identities. The DMK very explicitly made its election as a work to protect Dravidian civilization against some northern invader. Mamta Banerjee very skillfully succeeded in presenting the BJP as an outsider masculine force, and that was basically almost foreign to the ground of West Bengal, and so you cannot focus only on welfareism alone, but see how does it connect. The fact that in UP, welfareism was actually synonymous of the individual bounty or benevolence of the leadership, both prime minister and chief minister also, although to a lesser extent. And so you have an association that is created between welfare and the personal, bountifulness or generosity of, the leadership who provide and so forth. And so all those registers are entangled deeply with one another. And that's our job, I think, is to see how, in what ways they are made to connect.
Yeah. Neelam, linked to that, can we explore a little bit more your very interesting last slide about the differences between rural and urban, and how the gap was narrowing in rural areas where one would have anticipated, just on common sense, based on all the migration back into rural areas post-COVID, in the COVID phase, etc., that economic distress would be quite high, but that the anxiety around jobs would be very high in urban areas. So, and we saw a lot of the welfare stuff was in some ways directed into rural India, although urban India also did get the free ration and the Jan Dhan, etc. So just wanting to understand a little bit more your hypotheses on why we are seeing these differences, and how much does, we talk a lot about caste, we talk a lot about religion, but there's also age and gender, and how much do these factors play into what we are seeing?
So, I mean, I think it actually links quite well with the discussion on bipolarity. So when a system is shifting from a large number of parties to two parties, what is the claim that's being made about the incentives of the voter? So essentially, the argument that I think most political scientists buy is that there's no point in voting for a party that has no chance of winning the seat. And therefore, you strategically vote between one of the parties that has a chance of winning the seat, which creates these pressures towards two parties. Gary Cox, actually, who's not a specialist on Indian politics, but a very talented political scientist, noted a long time ago that even in multi-party Indian states, you actually look at the constituency level and you very rarely see more than two competitive parties. And it's exactly this phenomenon, right? So what has happened, when we say that the system is bipolar, it means that one of the parties that used to be competitive in some seats is no longer competitive in any seat, right? And therefore, which is the BSP, and therefore its voters are shifting one way or another. So for us to understand what happened in rural India versus urban India, we want to understand what is the set of voters that's actually shifting one way or another, right? Now, one of the things that's clear from the data is that the BJP has increased its vote share some, but it's not really increased it hugely anywhere. So whatever numbers it was getting in 2019, certainly, but even 2017, it hasn't significantly improved on it.
So in a sense, it hit its own glass ceiling.
It's hit its own glass ceiling, which is a very high glass ceiling, right? But yes, but yes. So what it means is that insofar as a voter who had not been voting for the BJP in 2017 saw and believed that it was in my best interest to vote for the Samajwadi Party, that person seems to have done so, and disproportionately so in rural areas. So the question is, why might that be? One is, of course, the core of BSP voters in rural areas versus urban areas. A second is our assumption that Hindu-Muslim polarization tends to be greater in urban areas. So there might be an affirmative reason for people to vote for the BJP vis-a-vis the Samajwadi Party. The third, and I think in some ways, the most complicated story to unravel is that, we've been throwing around dominant party system, but the other part of democratic theory is that should never happen, right? So one of the sort of strange things is a very famous definition of democracy is a system which sees regular party alternation, Adam Jaworski, right? And the argument is that even if I support a minority of voters, I can always pander to some subset of the voters of the other side and build my own majority, especially if they get angrier, right? And that should happen regularly. So the question for us is to understand, where did this sort of rural discontent come from, right? Why is it that voters who may have been shifting from the BSP said, okay, I would still rather vote for the Samajwadi Party than shift to the BJP, no matter what anybody says. I might be a Hindu, but this is not appealing to me. And I do think that despite the narrative that unless you're somebody who's already a believer in Modi, you just saw that given how much economic difficulty there is, coronavirus may not have been a direct story in the election, but there's a lot of economic distress, and a ration is certainly not making up. And we heard it many times in the field. Even women who said, I will vote for Modi, said, this ration doesn't make up for the price rise, right? I mean, that was very clear in people. It's not like people can't do basic calculations. So trying to unpack that, I mean, I think that's sort of what's in play.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the critical things to better understand going forward. One last question before we open it up. Again, coming back to this bipolarity question, are we going to see this increasingly across states in India? Is this a new phenomenon that is emerging now, that now contestations are basically going to be with BJP versus one key party that is dominant in particular states, and that key party could well be the Congress in some states?
Yeah, so it depends. Basically, so in Congress versus BJP states, we could actually see party system breaking up, especially if AAP moves in and it manages to create some sort of right noise. We saw that happening in Punjab. Punjab was actually a bipolar state till 2017. Now, like before 2017, basically AAP moves in 2017, and now it was a very, very fractured election at the constituency level. In some states, the way I was thinking about it, especially states where there is significant Muslim population and BJP is one significant player, there we might see emergence of bipolarity, because there would be a process of consolidation and counter consolidation on the religion axis. States which already have bipolarity in form of Congress versus BJP, given the state of affairs within the Congress party, we might actually see emergence of either, in some places, players from the Congress party, or a new player moving in, like Aam Aadmi Party. So, going forward, I can't predict which way each of these states.
To complete what Rahul says, we should remember that there's still a lot of political pluralism, in India, and there's still a very large number of parties beyond, the few truly bipolar states that we have. But there's also another phenomenon that contributes to increasing the winning threshold. One, of course, are the gains that the BJP has succeeded in gaining, over the years, but also the fact that fewer and fewer voters compared to the past are willing to waste their votes by, giving it away to a small party. So if you look at the cumulative vote share of major parties across states, those numbers are increasing at very high level. This election in UP, 95% of all voters gave their votes to one of the four major parties or one of their allies. And years ago, you would find 15 to 20% of the vote share, getting scattered and distributed across independent candidates and minor parties. And so voters being strategic are not willing to waste their vote. And that means not only that the winning threshold increase, but also that the kind of campaign, the kind of strategy, the kind of calculation you need to do also change, because you have to account for that. So the rule in India was, you need to divide the electorate in order to build majorities. That seems to be changing.
Yeah, I mean, my small hypothesis is that parties that are built around an identity-based coalition, if you have multiple of those parties, you can see how you can get multipolarity in a system, right? Either people within a constituency only vote for their party, or different regions have different identity-based densities, and so you get different parties. As we sort of see these new entrants being more universalistic in nature, not necessarily beholden to one identity group or another, that's not true of all of them, I'm not sure that you would get that kind of identity-based clustering of votes and parties.
So in that sense, that's a very big possible shift in the nature of party competition, right?
Mobilizing on narrow identities is going to be lesser and lesser rewarding.
Absolutely.
Which does not mean that mobilizing on identities per se become necessarily less relevant.
No, but at the center of it also is the religious polarization piece that we can't ignore in around all of this.
It also plays a role.
Exactly. And a lot of political parties are stepping around it rather than building new coalitions that address it or tackle it.
And when there is a model that seems to work, others will try to emulate.
Pick it up. Yeah, absolutely. Well, with that, let's open up to questions, and I am going to hand over my moderator duties to Neelanjan. So over to you.
Thank you. Just as a reminder, for those of you who have questions out there in cyberspace, please go and ask it in the Q&A box, and those are being fed to me, and I will bring it up to the panel. So let me start. I'm going to sort of mix questions that I might have of each of you with questions from the audience. But let me start with an audience question from Avinash Rai. So one of the noticeable things here is all of the important Mauryas lost the election, including Yogi Adityanath's deputy chief minister, right? Lost the election. There's a question about what does this say about the strength that Yogi has within the party? Will this kind of loss strengthen Yogi's hold on the party, state unit? And given the fact that I'm adding something to the question here, given the fact that after the election, Modi rarely even has referred to Yogi Adityanath, right? He has in fact taken a lot of credit for what happened in these elections. What kind of changes do you think Yogi will try to make to his image, and how do you think he'll try to start advertising himself?
So one, I basically think very
I'm
differently.
modern.
Yeah. I think very differently about power politics. Power, even at 300 seats, you can basically run very lame duck. And even with 202 seats, you can project a very, very powerful image. So whether Yogi will become more powerful after defeat of Keshav Prasad Maurya, I don't know. Whether he played a role, I don't know. These are basically speculations and rumors. And so it's a matter of projections. Some people who don't want to. So, for example, if Prime Minister Modi is angry with Yogi, is he going to call him and scold him? Just say, "Bhai, dekh lena." ऐसे ही होता है ना. Now it depends on Yogi वो क्या देखते हैं, right? So PM ने there was rumor ना, PM sent former IAS AK Sharma to the state to basically help Yogi in administration. Yogi said, AK Sharma साहब आप West UP संभालो. Right, so it depends on whether the person is taking indication from the PM or not, right? So I think that kind of game is for, and this is not related to the question, is good for gossip, but not for analysis, because it gets played among very few players that we can't basically build generalized model how people are going to react. It's very idiosyncratic. It depends on certain times how people are going to react. Now, on PM not taking Yogi's name, PM didn't take name of any chief minister for that matter. Not just this time, not last time also. And there are certain decorums that party maintains. So a friend of mine asked me, "Oh, but why is Nitin Gadkari sitting on the dais? Is he important?" No, because all three who were sitting on the dais with the prime minister were either the current president of the party or former presidents of the party. That's how parties function, right? So there are, even when BJP president is going to go to an RSS meeting, BJP president will get only one chair in the room, and perhaps will be sitting with an affiliate organization who might be just commanding 5,000 sort of like volunteers. But then they are basically, each one of them are just representing one organization. So they are just one among 20. It's not that because you are running the biggest party, you will get the largest sofa in the room, right? There are certain things that happen in some decorum. That's how I think about these things.
Yeah, but the question was not that he was physically absent, but it was absent from the speech as well, right? I mean, he literally...
No, but PM didn't take name of any chief minister of BJP.
Yes, precisely. But I don't think it's a question of form or decorum. It's a calculated political, decision of, credit taking.
You can now. I think we will have a differences of opinion on this one. So,
but I want to add something on Neelanjan, and the question from Avinash is I take issue with the way those small caste or backward caste leader gets spoken about. Or,
he didn't put that by the eye.
No. I don't have an issue. No, the question is, it's an excellent question, but it leads me to the point that there seemed to have been this assumption that waving those caste mascots from one party to another was the perfect way to sort of sway all the support from all the members of those castes, if they were blindly following these leaders, or very often self-appointed leaders, purely blinded by caste affiliations, and completely forgetting that voters belonging to those groups are as sophisticated as voters who belong to any other group. And so most of those caste leaders are inducted, co-opted, and shown around to display in a display of inclusion and inclusiveness. But the real political way that these leaders have is at best very localized, and as we've seen, very limited.
Can I add to that question? Now I have an answer to that. There are good reasons why anyone should not be taking the name of those four chief ministers during that speech. Because if PM had taken the name of those chief ministers in that speech, means that PM endorsed, and then the BJP does not have the ability to backtrack if it wants to appoint anyone else at the position of chief minister. So all of these are basically calculated thoughts on what to say or not to say at that moment. Why will you only endorse Yogi Adityanath, but not endorse Pushkar Dhami at that moment, who has lost the seat? Why will you not say something about the Pradeep Sawant and other things? So that's why, and I'm not like, I don't know what Modi thinks, but I'm just guessing that this is one reason why he would stop taking name of any chief minister.
I will not take a position on this at all. We have a question from Ravinder Kaur. I'm assuming the Ravinder Kaur who works on the substance of this question. So we have a question here about how do we make sense of the fact that the electoral field is not necessarily even, right? That the BJP, right, has an advantage in finance, electoral bonds. It has an advantage in media. How far would you say that these sort of differences, right, differences in material conditions, publicity, mobilization, so on and so forth, create a role in creating, and these are words that Ravinder has used, a hegemonic political system?
Yeah.
How much would you say that this sort of uneven sort of set of resources that the BJP has creates a hegemonic political system?
There is no doubt that there is an enormous skewed distribution of resources available, in favor of the BJP in every election that it contests. It outspends its adversary manifold in most cases. It has this almost hegemonic, it saturates the public sphere with its image, with the image of the prime minister or chief minister. It has it exerts a dominating presence over the media and the media space. I mean, you can make a long list of, structuring factor working in, disproportionately in favor of the BJP. And yet those factors don't automatically produce the same results every time. In West Bengal, the BJP was defeated, even though it put more money into that election than the Trinamool. AAP is very, very far from having the spending capacity that the BJP has, even at the scale of a city-state like Delhi. And so, while I'm not discounting, it is highly problematic that also the lack of rules and regulation on party communication outside conventional or traditional modes of communication, the fact that the ECI has no jurisdiction over pretty much anything that happens online, or spending that happens online. And there's a story today in the Al Jazeera that gives a glimpse about some of the mechanisms that corporations can also use to support political parties, even outside the mechanism, the electoral bond, which itself is highly problematic and completely skewed in favor of the BJP. And so these are all very, very serious problems. There is an invisibility, there is an organized invisibilization of the opposition. But yet, in certain states and in certain circumstances, it's still not enough, not for the BJP to never be challenged. And so we have to look at what are the other factors that intervene and that help helps parties that understand that spend far less or that have far lesser resources that they can command to still be able to put up a challenge to the BJP.
No, we should collect some questions from the room.
Okay, so let me just add a couple of minutes, and then I'll push it up to. I see that there are a number of questions that are brewing in the room. So I agree with everything that Gilles said. It's certainly not a foregone conclusion, especially in state elections, where we have seen the BJP lose a number of state elections, One of the things that I have argued, and I still sort of think quite a bit, is that the current organization in terms of resources is geared towards centralization right at the top. And at times that actually disadvantages the state chief minister, especially chief ministers who were appointed before Modi came into power, right? We've seen people who we never thought would lose, people like Shivraj, Raman Singh, and they lost immediately after Modi came to power. It has a lot to do with the fact that these chief ministers built their popularity around welfareism, and Modi has also built his popularity around welfareism. So it's as if somebody is able to sort of steal all of the appeal from his own chief ministers. At least in my view, that's sort of what's going on. But I think we shouldn't shy away from the second part of what could be happening here, right? Which is that it's an empirical question. We don't need to take a stand on whether there's democratic backsliding in India. But there's a concern that it is not a level playing field. And one empirical implication of that is that you don't get political alternation, right? If it is not a level playing field, it is very, very hard for the opposition to compete on equal footing. So, it may be that the BJP has an advantage in political finance. That's okay. But if the BJP is using its state power to benefit itself, to threaten corporates, or to be, sort of give state access to corporates in some way to enrich itself, then that's a problem, right? And these are things that we don't know, right? And these are things that and I'm not taking a stand on. But we should just be honest with ourselves that if we are empirically seeing something that looks like a dominant party system or a hegemonic party system, that we need to be concerned that there are anti-democratic things that are going on as well. Okay. Opening it up to Weber.
I think over the last couple of years, we've seen argument about how the voters sort of differentiate between they vote for at the state level versus the central. And I was just wondering, especially both in light of Uttar Pradesh and the other elections that we've seen, and especially because there's so much of the rhetoric of the domination what happens to that kind of differentiation and does it sort of continue, or is it going to go a certain way, and there could possibly be more people voting for the same people at the center at the state level?
I'm going to collect a few, Phil, and then I'll move to this side. I'm just sort of this way.
Just one small point. When I teach my course, I have found only one serious article on strategic voting that I can think of anyhow. And I'd love to have additional serious work on that. And similarly, it seems to me that, again, I've prepared for these results discussions by rereading Prashant Jha and reading Rajiv Prasad and focusing and precisely listening workers in finance. And I'm just curious whether there are anyone who actually goes and systematically studies that. If not, it should be, it seems to me. Sampling the workers, it should be sampling and seeing over time how those things change.
One more question on this one. Yeah.
So I saw one chart on social media showing 8% of the Muslims voted for BJP, while an overall majority consolidated behind Samajwadi Party. So has anyone done a study on who are these 8%, what is their distribution, and what made them to vote for BJP? So I want to an explanation. What explains that?
Okay, so I'll start with those three, and then I know there are a number of questions on this side, and I'll go to this side. I promise we'll get to the end. I think we have plenty of time. Okay.
I can take the last one.
Okay, so Rahul, you want to take the last one on?
So I looked at, so CSDS data continuously has been showing since 2004 that across the country, BJP gets around 8 to 10% of Muslim votes. There are patterns of who the BJP's Muslim voters are, and I wrote an article on this in the print 2 years back. basically Muslim BJP voters are very few, and no one believes who voted for the party. But basically, there are, if you think in terms of Muslim caste groups, it's something like Shias in parts of UP, Bohras in parts of Gujarat, and there are voters in Karnataka. And there are good ethnographic studies, especially about the Bohra Muslims in Gujarat, people have done. The second, they are basically the BJP Muslim voters are on average more religious, more ideologically conservative. They are more likely to be male, and they are also more likely to be educated. Those are basically the correlations, but that's all a survey can tell you. We need a much more detailed study focusing on just Muslim voting behavior. And it's difficult to do. It's difficult to do because once you go for this serious kind of survey of Muslim voters, they will hide this fact, right? Because if there are other people within the community, either standing nearby, it would not be strategic for them to reveal their true preference of actually they might have voted for BJP. So it's a hard question, but someone should look at it. And BJP, Muslims voting for BJP is not something unique. Even African American voters in UK, US, there are 8 to 10% who have been consistently voting for the Republican Party.
But the other side is that if you know the survey data that we've seen are correct, they point at the highest degree of consolidation of Muslim votes behind a single party ever observed in UP. But I've written about this also about past elections, and the fact that you have so much fluctuation is also indicative that Muslim voters tend to be actually quite strategic. I mean, I think the myth that of Muslim bloc voting has been debunked and should continuously be debunked. And the fact that you have this consolidation now does not necessarily mean that all Muslims in UP voted as one for the Samajwadi Party. They made assessment and they made calculations also from the particular side of their own constituencies, localities, and so forth. Are we going to see less decoupling of state and national election behavior? We have to be a little bit. We have to take a little bit of distance and see that. So this is this is an election cycle which was filled with superlatives, right? And it's easy to be awestruck by the magnitude of the BJP performance or the magnitude of AP's performance in Punjab as well. But if you put that into a longer string, of state elections, you still see that the BJP lost most of their home, a very large number of those state elections. And so right now we have this, big event, in front of us, and it's, it can make us forget about, the fact that, there were elections before, there are elections after. There are 11 elections going to take place before the next general elections. So, so it's hard to say that this is what's happening now will necessarily happen later. I mean, I've been observing elections for quite a long time now, and the number of times I've been surprised, by outcomes is, more than I can remember. And we are seeing things that we haven't seen before in these elections, and I suspect that, there will be also a lot of surprise in future elections. So we can't really say now whether we're going to see these. Lastly, so many of these, there's also, an element of circumstances, right? What are the circumstances that are particular to an election that, shape also, can also contribute to shape outcome. AP's victory in Punjab is as much a product of circumstances than smart election, campaigning by AP. And so in a way that makes it a very unique election, right? And yeah.
So this would be a good year for BJP. Next would be bad. If you just look at the states, the 11, most of the states that are going to, that would be largely a bad year.
But that's the question. I mean, I think the one question I do have, no answers, no claims, is that the phenomenon that we see at the national level of BJP versus Congress contests, right? Where in 2014 and 2019, the BJP has won more than 90% of the contests head to head. Is that a phenomenon that we're going to start seeing having a bearing on states? I mean, I wouldn't read too much into a close electoral win for one way or another, but we have 4 states that sort of right off the top of my head, right? Gujarat, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, which are going to be quite interesting to think about in terms of BJP Congress battles. Given that Modi is now increasingly projected in state elections and they found an effective tool, I think that's something to keep an eye on, right? That the lack of competitiveness that we see at the national level, is it going to start percolating to the state level? No answers, no claims, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Can I just on Phil's question, quick one word? We don't have good studies, especially on strategic voting in India, and there are good reasons for it. I do think that a large portion of voters are actually what you will call as sincere or loyal voters. Second, the problem to study strategic voting, you have to actually ask the question first, which is your first preferred party, second preferred party, and third preferred party. And rarely in any election survey, we ask those preferences, because you can only think about the movement from first to second to the third. When first you need to know the preference order, then you have to ask them which party is likely to win, right? So there has to be a whole set of just questions on strategic voting, and Neelan has promised me to get a grant to study this.
So I'm so what can I see next show of hands here? Let's see. So 1, 2, oh, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, go ahead.
So mine is continuation with his question about the Muslim vote. Actually, one can compare the Access My India exit poll with CSDA's data about how women have voted, where in Access My India poll, women from all categories except SC Jatav have voted for BJP in higher numbers, while Muslim women have voted even higher numbers for SP. But we have the data to show that, at least to demonstrate that women have certain issues upon which they vote for BJP. Like, do we have data to show on what basis Muslim women vote, or for that matter, is it merely a politics of representation?
And I should also warn, this is where my those numbers of female Muslim voters answering surveys have huge uncertainty and huge bias. And I'm not saying that they're correct or incorrect, but for us to try to make deep claims based on what Access or CSDS have shown on those numbers, I think even they would tell you not to do it. Right.
They should tell you if they're not.
Yeah.
Basically, as you divide the sample into these smaller groups, there is very high level of uncertainty associated with the way it was sampled. And that's why what Neelan is saying, we should not be drawing too much of a conclusion or over-interpreting that. You can just basically read it for a trend, but don't say, oh, 8 or 9 are these two numbers different. No, they are not. Even 18 or 25 is not different if we don't know how the sample was constructed.
Surveys are only good to what they've been designed for. And there's always a temptation to try to dig deeper and deeper. But then,
Okay, so I'm going to take these 3 more questions and try to keep them a bit short so we can make sure to get people.
Yeah, and we end with that.
Yes, and we'll end with this one.
So I was very curious about the slide where you mapped the relationship between the percentage of rural landscape and the difference in vote share, and you also presented like a similar version for Punjab. So would it be fair to say that if the dependence on state or the expectation from the state is high, which is at least in popular perception higher for rural areas than for urban areas, the voting preferences are likely to be anti-incumbent, or is that too tall of a claim to make?
Next question, Bhanu, your question?
So I have a related question on women voters. I think Yamini asked that question. But the point here was that fundamentally women voting differently, and more women voting than men, right? And our
at least what we've read in the literature is that there should be inter-household barriers, there are no independent information sources, party workers deliberately do not target women voters. And I'm not sure in phases in Uttar Pradesh where women voters are higher and women are voting differently, or in West Bengal where women voters were high and they voted differently, whether any of these sort of barriers were broken, right? So I don't know if in Gonda or in West Bengal, a woman had an independent access to information, or party workers were targeting her specifically, or there were inter-household barriers. So either that stuff is wrong, or there's something that is going on in the field, which, so I thought maybe you guys can give us some answer to it.
And final question.
So, just in context of the electoral bonds, it seems like, there's a decimation of the smaller parties, that we saw in UP as well, like the BSPs out, Congress, marginal player out, everybody else, RJD, everybody has kind of, underperformed all the smaller parties, given the expectations and, those things. So on one side, you have to consider that as, one thing. And then welfareism. It becomes more and more difficult that, take money from the corporates, build these large organizations, large machines to fight elections, and then spend on welfareism, and that's the kind of key to winning or saving power. Would you agree with that kind of analogy? I think it's too simplistic.
Let me take the final question because that's something that is near and dear to my heart. So yes, I mean, one of the things we know in India beyond what is happening with political financing, which is a black box, is that we have extreme economic centralization happening, right? So the top corporates, the top 1% hold a disproportionate number of wealth. The top 20 companies in India make 70% of the profits, right? When you have that kind of cornering of capital, a party in power only needs to be able to make a deal with a very small number of players to have a disproportionate number of funds, right? Whether or not this is happening, to what extent it is happening, we don't know. But we know that the opportunity is there much more now than it was a decade ago or 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago. And one clear hypothesis is that this is why, and it is very, very difficult for any other party to make up the capital gap. So I agree with that. Anyone want to answer about women voters?
So I think that's a very important question Bhanu asked. I think we've been making a fundamental mistake, Bhanu, in study of voting behavior in India. We have I'm not saying all theories were wrong, and but we basically have been focusing too much on group identities and basically welfare, which basically for household would be same, right? So what we were basically doing is that if I know the caste of the person, I can, as Mark Snyder said, we can fairly guess estimate what the probability of that person is to vote for a particular party. In Delhi, and this was a very small study we did in 2020, where we just went to 300 households and interviewed around 1,200 voters. So in each household, we spoke to minimum 2 and maximum 4 voters. Even in Delhi 2020, all members of the household don't agree in the same way. It's not just men and women. Father and son vote differently, chacha and bhatija vote differently, mother-in-law, father-in-law vote differently. Now, if household, and 1/3 of the household, and there is no pattern why these households differ. We don't know, so that's why it's just a working paper we presented at WEPSA, right, Western Political Science Association. And so because basically at the identity level and at the welfare level, both these things are constant for every member of the household. But individual motivations of why people might be differing could be very different. One channel could be basically source of information. And I think in this day and age, that source of information is changing because all of us have our own individual handsets, right? So we may be joining very different set of WhatsApp group. We may be watching very different kind of YouTube videos. So we are getting very different kind of information. And plus, if you believe in the genetic theories of voting, then our brain is designed very differently, and that's why we may be leaning towards the conservative or other sides as well, right?
So I agree with Rahul. I think that's right, and I think there's an interesting study to be done about what kind of outreach was done around for getting formal bank accounts to women. I think that there is definitely a direct channel that exists to women that is being used by various politicians in terms of giving money directly into somebody's bank account and also messaging around it, right? And so we sort of need to think through what that's doing. Okay, we have one more. Did you want to add anything?
Very quickly at the same time, I mean, it's a health, reminder that all those headlines showing, women outvoting men either in an election or for a particular party, always remember that you still have much fewer women in the electorate than men because of gap of registration and by virtue of the skewed sex ratio. If you have fewer women in the population, by definition, you have fewer women in the electorate as well. I don't exactly remember the gap in UP in the 2019 election in terms of women versus men registration. The gap was still very large. And so even if you have these impressive percentages of women voting more for a party than another, you still have to balance it out with the demographic.
We should take the last question here. I think we'll move to
after that you can have
happy to discuss. So there's a final question that we should answer about the role of, we've seen a lot of movements in rural vote share, both in Punjab and in UP, sometimes in surprising ways. Based on trends that we're starting to see, is there an association with pro-incumbency or anti-incumbency and the rural vote?
You should answer that. You've been creating the misinformation.
So I've been creating the misinformation, yes. So look, my instinct is no, there isn't an obvious relationship. What we should take account of, which we don't, this is what Phil was sort of referring to, is we don't have a very good understanding of differences in mobilization between rural areas and urban areas. I'll tell you just very simply, like now every party does it. I think the BJP was the first to do it. If you ever look at their survey, right, it'll have, or what's given back to party workers. These are the top 3 issues in this neighborhood. This is how many houses are in this neighborhood. Strong lean for us, strong against, whatever, right? Just this piece of information. Now, I can see how that works in a rural area. It's not clear to me how that works in an urban area, right? And so I can see that in a circumscribed rural space, that differences in mobilization capacity can have potentially strong impacts. I have no idea how that works in urban areas. And given the level of interconnectedness now between rural and urban, as you know, CPR is at the forefront of saying that what you think is rural is not actually rural.
And what you think of urban is not actually urban.
That's right, exactly. So everything is confusing. That adds an extra dimension to this, right? That what we imagine as this village where you can neatly put into caste neighborhoods and how many houses and nobody goes outside, that's actually a very small percentage of India, increasingly small percentage of India.
And there is much more homogeneity in rural areas in terms of income and the kind of access they have. But if you think of an urban area like urban cluster, you will find extremely poor people to extremely rich people. So the elasticity of income.
So my instinct is it depends on a theory of the variation in mobilization, but that's a theory we don't have. So leave it there.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all for a wonderful panel, and thank you for those of you who survived an hour and a half in cyberspace. We look forward to an event soon, but thankfully the elections are over, so there won't be an election event for some time. Thank you all for coming, and please stay connected with CPR.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.